Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is our guest host, co-host, regular Embargoed participant. This is like your 700th episode at this point, Melissa. Welcome back to the pod, Melissa. Melissa Burgess.
Thank you, Tim. Pleasure to be here.
This is an emergency podcast, and so at some point I think our trusty producer Matt will probably bring in some emergency sound effects, but we're talking today about the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran that has led to several sanctions consequences. It happened only recently. I think it was signed a week ago in Geneva, or at least, actually in Versailles. It was the signature in Versailles. And so we essentially have a memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran. And the reason that we are treating this as an emergency is that it has at least two paragraphs in the memorandum of understanding that are extremely sanctions related. We're going to talk about those today. Paragraph 7 of the memorandum of understanding says that the United States undertakes to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, including United Nations Security Council resolutions, IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, all unilateral U.S. sanctions, primary, secondary, in an agreed upon schedule as part of the final deal. And then paragraph 7 goes on to acknowledge the critical importance of sanctions termination issue, and the parties express their intention to immediately address those issues in negotiations in order to achieve the mutual agreement on them. And then paragraph 10, similarly, it has the United States undertaking that immediately upon signing the MOU and until the termination of sanctions, the ones referenced in paragraph 7, the United States Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and derivatives, and all associated services, including banking transactions, insurances, transportation. So what we're going to talk about today is paragraph 7, which essentially the U.S. commits to lift all sorts of sanctions, including ones that are not U.S. sanctions, against Iran. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how and whether the president can do that. And then in paragraph 10, the U.S. took to immediately issue a waiver. And what happened after that was that pretty quickly the Treasury Department issued General License X, which looks a lot like the subjects talked about in paragraph 10. Namely, there was a general license that allowed U.S. persons to engage in transactions involving Iranian crude, petroleum products, and associated services. We'll talk a little bit about General License X. But because we're going to talk about kind of the president's power and how viable this is and what the mechanics are in terms of what the president and Congress would need to do in terms of paragraph 7 and 10, try and figure out what all this means. I think before that, we need a little bit of historical background about kind of all of the provisions in place that deal with sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran. With that, I will turn it over to you, Melissa, to talk about these. And before I do, though, I should point out that our friend Coleman Griffin may appear at any time to, on an emergency basis, to kind of supplement our discussion. But he might not, so we'll find out in the course of the podcast.
Keeping things exciting. So kind of going back to the very beginning, the Iran sanctions program started in November 1979. It was the first IEEPA sanctions program. So IEEPA had been passed at the very end of 1977. And then in response to events in Iran in 1979, President Carter issued a very short executive order invoking the National Emergencies Act and imposing basic sanctions blocking the property of the government of Iran and the Central Bank of Iran. This was, at this point in history, we did not yet have the Islamic Republic, or at least it was not officially recognized. I forget the exact timeline there. So this is one of the few Iran sanctions programs that does not address that full current title of the government of Iran. Again, it was a very basic sanctions, blocking sanctions that was in place for well, it's still in place. It's been renewed to this day every year. Um, but it has been expanded on in numerous ways. The Iran sanctions program is one of the most complex, if not the most complex program in terms of, and I think it's a bit debatable, but just in terms of the number of statutes that either require imposing sanctions or that to adjust the sanctions in some way or that require reporting relating to the activities that drove the sanctions, continue to drive sanctions that are
Yeah,
still in place.
I think Iran might win the prize for
Yeah.
the
Yeah, and if you
most.
if you if you look up some of those Congressional Research Service reports, we were trolling through a few in the last few days, and they are extensive
Yeah,
in the
they have
statutes
to have
they
a
reference, the reports
chart just to
they,
list all
yes.
the statutes that might possibly apply. I mean, Cuba, in my view, is a little bit harder to deal with because it's so old that a lot of the terms are just only used in the Cuba program. But Iran has so many different statutory authorities. But I did not mean to interrupt.
No, no, and there are numerous executive orders, which in many of the, shall we say, longer term sanctions programs, it's not unusual for Congress to build off of executive orders and then the executive orders to build off of statutes. So you do have a lot of that as well. Um, Zooming quickly through the history of this program, there was various activity in the 80s, but one of the biggest changes arguably occurred 1995 and 1996. So in 1995, President Clinton issued another IEEPA-based executive order, and that was kind of the first major restrictions on development of petroleum resources in Iran and U.S. participation in that. Um, and then about a year, not even a year, no, a little over a year later, we had one of the first executive orders that was not exclusively IEEPA based. It also was based on the International Security and Development Cooperation Act, and that's where we essentially get comprehensive sanctions on Iran. Very interesting features in that, features that if you have dealt with Russia sanctions, many of them will look very familiar in terms of new investment restrictions, goods and services restrictions, language about prohibiting approval and financing of activities that U.S. persons cannot themselves engage in. So that was arguably kind of one of the biggest, and then UN sanctions followed that after that in 2006. So that was like a decade later. But that Iran Sanctions Act also in 1996 was also one of those big, and continues to this day to control, as amended, to control the direction of most sanctions on Iran.
Yeah, that was the foundation that I think the program still sits on. But then in the 2000s, we have all of these kind of very specific laws that come up with respect to Iran sanctions.
Yeah. And only mirroring it in some ways, this is one of the few countries where Treasury has 3 different sets of regulations. So we have the Iran Assets Control Regulations. We have the IACR, the ITSR, and the IFSR. And that doesn't even get into many of the other or not necessarily directly related sanctions programs, but counterterrorism sanctions, and weapons of mass destruction sanctions, all of these other programs that may not be necessarily Iran specific, but they play significant roles within the country or on individuals or entities that are sanctioned but have some type of nexus to the country.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'd say in the last 7 years or so that the Iran sanctions have become completely intertwined with a lot of the counterterrorism sanctions, certainly after the designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. A lot of the sanctions, it was really hard to tell which program or which executive order they were going to be issued under, because for the same conduct, you could have sanctions under, just the normal Iran ITSR program in some programs or some similar conduct, you would have sanctions imposed under 13902, and then some similar conduct, Executive Order 13902. And then for similar conduct, you would have sanctions imposed under the foreign terrorist, the global terrorist program that deals usually, again, all of which involve transactions involving oil, but when they would use one program and when they would use another was often very difficult to discern, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. But I think building off of that and tying back into the language we have of the MOU, in some ways there's a lot of negotiating room or wiggle room, however you want to look at it, in terms of, if the U.S. is undertaking to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, thinking in a different context like Venezuelan sanctions, they're against the government of. So if the agreement is focused solely on the government of, this seems a bit broader, it seems more country-based, but that doesn't mean it's clearly or absolutely an agreement to waive all of those other programs that target entities within the country as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds. And I suspect we will see, to the extent some of the, shall we say, high-profile, key target entities within the country are not the front of the line for getting sanctions removed. We may see more cross-designations, as we've seen in other programs. I mean, some of them, interestingly, some of those kind of key players, like I think the IRGC and some others, are actually sanctioned under Russia programs as well. So that's going to be an interesting angle. I mean, on the one hand, kind of easy to just take them off, but on the other hand, that's a whole different reason to be sanctioned. So, and it's not an Iran-specific reason to be sanctioned.
Well, I mean, you raise a point that actually is going to come up, I think, as we start to kind of go down this road, assuming that the negotiations proceed towards, more sanctions relief than general license acts. And that is that when I was reading through some of the statutes, just kind of for this purpose, I mean, a number of them allow the president to waive sanctions in various circumstances, and that's pretty easy, right? I mean, the president just makes a finding. They have to do it over a certain amount of time. Often they will have to report to Congress on their finding, but there's really no restrictions other than the president just unilaterally decides to waive or not to waive sanctions. But there are other provisions, particularly with respect to termination, and I'm thinking of the one in CISADA in particular, but I'm sure there are others, that the president can only terminate sanctions if they make a particular finding with respect to various aspects of the Iranian government's behavior. One relates to nuclear materials, but also there's missiles, there is participation in terrorism, there's human rights, and so the termination of sanctions actually comes, at least in some of these statutes, with conditions where the president has to make various determinations that are beyond the scope of the MOU. I mean, the MOU deals, it seems on its face, to mostly just deal with Iran's nuclear program, which was the same subject to the JCPOA. But there are these other areas that where we've imposed sanctions, where lifting them would require findings outside of the scope of the nuclear program, and it'll be interesting to see how those play out in coming weeks and months and years.
Yep. So for those who don't know, CISADA is the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, passed in 2010, and many of the waiver provisions for Iran sanctions as a whole are contained in that act. That act actually amends that Iran Sanctions Act of 1996 that we mentioned earlier, and at least as of right now, it does have a sunset provision that has been extended multiple times. That sunset provision, the current one, expires on December 31st of this year. We assume it will be renewed, but just what that renewal will look like, or whether that's a chance to really rewrite a bunch of Iran sanctions statutes, we'll see in the next few months or weeks. But the major waiver provisions in there. So there's a provision that says that 30 days after the president certifies to Congress that the government of Iran has ceased providing support for acts of international terrorism and no longer satisfies the requirements for designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. And that's under the Export Administration Act, and it's the Export Control Reform Act as its successor statute, the Arms Export Control Act, the Foreign Assistance Act. So we have state sponsor of terrorism that has to be lifted, and then the president also has to be able to certify that Iran has ceased the pursuit, acquisition, and development of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and ballistic missiles and ballistic missile launch technology. So this is kind of one of the big linchpin, if you will, of if the president can certify that, there's a lot of room for the president to waive sanctions or for Congress also for the act to just automatically sunset. Then there are other waiver provisions that are less complete. But the president has to report to Congress, submit a report to Congress if and when he does that. Like there's one where the president can waive certain things if he determines it's in the country's national interest, the U.S. national interest to do so. So obviously that's a little easier to issue a waiver if you determine that whether it's for the purpose of negotiations or a broader, more longer lasting purpose, well, this is in the U.S. national interest to waive certain provisions, waive extensive provisions. Obviously, anything that, to the extent anything is exclusively IEEPA based affecting Iran anymore, that's pretty easy to lift comparatively. But so little is exclusively IEEPA based that almost anything does require some kind of report to Congress or certification to Congress, or it's time limited. Several things have, 30-day requirements, 180-day waivers, some things like that, as we've seen in other cases, like similar to Syria, where we had to have a waiver first.
So I think that really the question that is going to have to be asked going forward for the people who are negotiating over what this sanctions relief provision is going to be in paragraph 7 is that somebody's going to have to sit down with all these statutes and figure out how it is that the U.S. what needs to happen in order for the U.S. to terminate sanctions against Iran. Because a lot of things, there are a lot of laws. I think we've established that there are a lot of laws. They have a lot of complicated termination provisions, waiver provisions that are out there. I didn't see, by the way, any licensing provisions. So it doesn't appear to me that there's any restrictions that would stop the U.S. from issuing general licenses like General License X, which is similar to general license. It's much broader, but during the process of negotiating the JCPOA, the Treasury Department issued various general licenses along the way as a confidence building measure. And I think part of that is that there just aren't the same sorts of statutory restrictions on licensing that there are on terminating the program or even suspending the program under the waiver provision. But I think that, what this makes clear, somebody's going to have to do a ton of thinking over the course of the next 60 days as to how mechanically they go about doing that, beginning with this, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Relief Act of 2015 that was passed at the time of the JCPOA that gave Congress a say in any agreement entered into by the president that dealt with Iran's nuclear program. I mean, it was designed to allow congressional review of the JCPOA, but it seems on its face to have some applicability here where we've got an agreement signed by the U.S. and Iran to terminate sanctions on Iran as part of a nuclear negotiation, and then a promise to, and one that's already been kept, a promise to provide intermediary sanctions relief through, it says the Treasury Department, so presumably they already had the General License X in mind when they issued paragraph 10. they've already done some of it. So it seems like the questions on the table are kind of what's Congress's role in up or down approval of this agreement, and then going forward, how is it that the president is going to effectuate paragraph 7, because 7 promises to lift all sorts of sanctions, and as you've made very clear, there's a ton of restrictions on the president's ability to do that.
Yep. And I think, I mean, for a variety of reasons, that's why they essentially agreed to come up with a plan to then lift sanctions, because there are just so many sanctions, so many reporting deadlines, and then of course there's also that agreement in there about approaching the UN essentially, which that's
and the IEEPA.
Yes. So there's a lot that the U.S. can't do unilaterally, even if it actually wanted to. But I do think INARA is a very interesting twist here, because if you look at some like prior CRS reports issued and written after INARA became law, they don't even stop and think about, oh, that actually has a role in how the president could go about lifting sanctions if he felt the need or there was a good reason to do so. And that's like INARA is not something we've had for any of the other programs like Syria that we were able to fairly easily lift those sanctions, at least comparatively. It was fairly easy to lift those sanctions, first via general license and then repeal, and again, like creation of the new PARS program for Syria.
But part of what slowed it down in Syria, is a good example. Syria was a designated state sponsor of terror, and actually undoing that took some time. It was a little bit easier to do that under the circumstances as well, because the Assad government had fallen, and so whatever role Syria had played in sponsoring state terrorism, it was a new government and a completely new regime. So you could credibly say, we're not going to hold this new regime, we're not going to saddle them with the baggage of the old regime since they overthrew the old regime. It's a little harder here, where it's not clear that anything has really changed in the last 6 months with respect to Iran's government. I mean, the identity of the individuals has changed, and maybe, we'll see their role in sponsoring state terrorism is or will change, but there hasn't been a change, the sort of break that there was in Syria that made undoing those provisions, the terrorism designations, a little bit easier. Whereas it still wasn't easy, but it was easier because you had a bright line. Whereas here, it's hard to see how you undo some of those designations unless there's some sort of new evidence about the quote unquote new regime as opposed to the old regime.
And not to oversimplify, but I think the cast of characters or the relevant pool for Syria was comparatively far and geographically far more limited than just the reach of Iran sanctions to, China and really all around the world.
There wasn't a 40-year history of statutes with respect to Syria. There just is so much to go through in the weeds with respect to Iran.
Yeah. So that definitely will be an interesting feature to see how that unfolds, plays out. It's clearly one of the reasons that this is merely an MOU and not the final agreement.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So I think we've established pretty clearly that there's going to be a lot of work to be done on how you do this. But also, paragraph 7 in particular, starts with the idea that the U.S. is going to terminate all sorts of specific sanctions. So including UN Security Council resolutions, which, as you've already pointed out, that's a promise that the U.S. can't keep on its own. There are a number of members of the Security Council, and they all, as I understand it, have their own particular vetoes. So you've got to get everybody. And so, that's something that the U.S. is committed to doing, but is going to take more than the U.S. to do. I think a lot of the members of the Security Council will be glad to have a peace agreement that everyone agrees on and may well do it. I'm not saying that they can't, but they can't do it unilaterally. And then, IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, again, the U.S. isn't going to be able to do it alone. I assume that they might be able to exercise considerable leverage in getting those done. But, primary sanctions, and for those of our kind of non-trade listeners, this primary and secondary sanctions comment, the primary sanctions are the sanctions with a connection to the U.S. So the entire set of Iran sanctions regulations that we've been talking through are almost exclusively primary sanctions, where they tell U.S. connected actors and in connection with U.S. connected transactions, here are the things you can and can't do with respect to Iran. The entire primary sanctions network is really what we're talking about. Well, it's not entirely what we're talking about, but it's mostly what we're talking about in connection with these are in place, and Congress has actually said, these laws can only be lifted in the following circumstances. And so this network of Iran sanctions that are primary are almost all locked in place absent some sort of presidential waiver or meeting of the termination provision or both. The secondary sanctions are the sanctions that apply to transactions without a U.S. nexus. And again, some of them are statutory. I think CISADA created a number of secondary sanctions, and there were some other later laws that did as well. And so in connection with the secondary sanctions, those are more easily lifted. Those were what were lifted in the JCPOA. That was the only thing the JCPOA lifted. But again, like even there are some congressional guardrails that are going to have to be met. How do you see kind of this negotiation playing out, Melissa? I mean, do we see Congress getting involved in this? They already have some sort of potential involvement just by approval of the agreement, or the provisions that allow them essentially to disapprove of the agreement, because that, I think, is the way that the INARA is structured. But I think that, there is a much bigger congressional role to play, so lifting primary sanctions and potentially lifting secondary sanctions. So,
well, I think, Congress gave itself a lot of opportunities to get involved over the last decades. And I think it probably has a vested interest in getting involved in a variety of ways. I think, the overarching consensus, obviously not 100%, but the overarching consensus is like, yes, let's get some type of peace agreement. But I think appetites vary significantly over just what that can look like and how far it will go and what the strings will be attached to it. I expect there will be a, whether it's as part of extending the sunset on CISADA and the Iran Sanctions Act, or something separate, I suspect there will be, I'm sure, new reporting requirements to Congress and new waiver requirements, but also lifting or maybe amending some of them as an attempt to, okay, these are the congressional bright lines, and these are, where we're maybe going to be a little flexible. I mean, there has to be a lot of politics will go into it, of course, but there's also a lot of, I think, flexibility for the president and Treasury to do very time limited, whether it's waivers, whether it's licenses, and very condition based approaches. Like, oh, we have to be able to certify to Congress X, Y, and Z. So some of the statutes, I think there's like a 6-month look back on what the president can look back on, either for terrorism or WMD, one of those, or maybe it's ballistic missiles. But we have to be able to tell them that for 6 months you've been good. So this one is only good for 6 months.
Right. Well, and it could inject those issues into these negotiations, right? I mean, they're certainly not part of the MOU, but because these provisions can't be lifted without some sort of finding by the president on WMD. I mean, it could be that the president will say, my hands are tied. I can't, I want to do this, but you got to help me here because there's laws. But to your other point, which is kind of a wild card in this, some of these provisions like CISADA sunset from time to time. Now, nobody ever really thinks about that because they're routinely extended. But if the president wanted to go about kind of eliminating at least some of these waiver and termination restrictions,
Run the
could be
clock
allowed,
out.
right? You run the clock out, right? It could be allowed.
Yeah.
Those provisions, CISADA for sure. It looks like it expires at the end of the year. We didn't take a comprehensive look at some of the others, but if to the extent these statutes expire, if the president doesn't want them to be renewed because they're tying his hands too much, it's pretty easy to keep a statute from being, re-upped if you want to. Because if the president says no, they need super majorities in the House and Senate in order to extend it. So that is another wild card in this. Maybe some of these findings don't have to be made because the laws just sunset.
Yeah, maybe. Though, interestingly, I think the last extension of the sunset, which was about 10 years ago, actually became law without presidential signature under, I forget which other law provides for that to happen, but it was a very limited, self-contained. This was not attached to an NDAA or anything else that wouldn't have just automatically become law without the president's signature. But I did find that interesting, thinking back like 2016, what was going on when they extended that sunset another 10 years on CISADA and the Iran Sanctions Act. But yeah, I think the summary here is this could go so many different directions. It's not going to be straightforward. There are a lot of opportunities for Iran not to get what it wants, at least what it seems to want in terms of full sanctions relief, either because the president and the administration have a lot of reasons to say our hands are tied on X, Y, and Z unless you do A, B, C, because otherwise we can't certify, so we can't lift. There are also a lot of opportunities to terminate a national emergency, lift at least the IEEPA-based portions, and anything else that would hinge exclusively on IEEPA. A lot of opportunities for Congress to get involved. And I think it's interesting because, again, we have the Venezuela model that's ongoing. We have the Syria model that's ongoing. If we look back a few years, there was very simple Zimbabwe sanctions that were lifted, and that was we lift the program, but we redesignate the core individuals under a different program. So I think we will see all of those options and then some, again, because it's such a complex program, and you can't, as you've said, you can't lift decades of sanctions in a day like you could somewhat for Syria. And maybe in that way, maybe the China sanctions are in some ways the best model, because that was decades before, from when China went from being comprehensively sanctioned, again, think Nixon in China, to now most of us don't remember that it was sanctioned.
Which just to preview and give ourselves a little bit of advanced billing, we're going to do an entire history of sanctions podcast with Rachel Alpert in a couple of weeks, I think. But for now, I mean, it is really a good precedent, right? I mean, undoing the China sanctions was hard, but again, here I think there's a lot of factors in play. Like the negotiations in some ways could spill over into other issues besides the nuclear program, because the statutes kind of require it in order to do what you need to do to lift the sanctions. It's possible that some of these provisions could be allowed to sunset to take away some of the restrictions on the president. It's not clear to me how the INARA compliance will take place in connection with this statute, because I think everybody thinks of INARA as a law that Congress passed just to kind of give Obama a little bit of trouble in connection with the JCPOA, but it's not written that way. Like it applies to all agreements with respect to lift sanctions as part of in exchange for some sort of deal with respect to Iran's nuclear program, which the MOU pretty clearly seems to be. So we'll have to watch for that. I think that all of this is why the negotiations are going to be very complicated and will probably take a while. What didn't take a while was General License X, right? So General License X was a license that was issued by OFAC. I think within days after the MOU was signed. I'm looking for the date on it. It's Brad Smith's signature.
22nd.
It looks like 21st at 12:56 is when his signature is digitally signed. But that takes effect on the 22nd. It is a general license that allows all transactions, ordinarily an incident to the production, sale, delivery, or offloading of crude, petrochemical products, petroleum products of Iranian origin, including transactions involving vessels blocked under the above listed authorities. And at the top of GLX, there are a lot of authorities that are listed. I mean, it's the Russian sanctions under 14024, the Russian sanctions under the previous Obama executive orders, the weapons of mass destruction sanctions in Part 544, the IPSR that you've already talked about in 561, the human rights sanctions in 562, the global terrorism sanctions in 594, Trump's executive order for 13846, which is what reimposed the sanctions after the original Iran deal, a bunch of other executive orders with respect to Iran, and 13902, 13949, and 13876. So essentially everything that could conceivably stop the movement of production, delivery, and sale of Iranian petroleum products is now authorized, including, there's a note that tells, that says specifically U.S. dollar denominated transactions are allowed as well. It goes through August 21st, which is what, 90 days? Is that 60 days? 60 days, which makes sense because paragraph 7 says we're going to negotiate for 60 days. So it's in place, and it went in place almost immediately. I mean, this kind of illustrates the president's ability to do things by GL is a lot broader than the president's ability to terminate or waive sanctions that have been adopted by Congress. This was also something that was done, I think, in connection with the Syria program, when the Syria sanctions were lifted because of some of the restrictions. It was done in Afghanistan when the Taliban came back into power. There was a general license that essentially allowed transactions with the government of Afghanistan because the Taliban was now, at least parts of the Taliban were a foreign terrorist organization, and so they had to kind of figure out how it is that people could deal with the government of Afghanistan despite the U.S. sanctions restrictions on parts of dealing with the government. So general license is kind of the quick way to do this. Thoughts on kind of the breadth of this general license and how it will work?
On the one hand, it is very broad, but on the other hand, this is actually not as extensive as, say, the Afghanistan GL, because this is not authorization to, do anything and everything with the government of Iran or IRGC or you name it. It is limited to, anything ordinarily incident and necessary to production, sale, delivery, offloading. Yes, there are other existing general licenses for Iran. Many of them have been in place also for decades, humanitarian, internet freedom, a lot of those other things, those continue to exist and are not affected by this. And yes, in a lot of ways you can say it's a big win or a very temporary win, on paper at least, for Iran to have this 60-day license. Hard to say how many vessels and all the rest can act that quickly to use this, except for ones that were probably going to act anyway, which probably makes it easier to issue this, just like we saw earlier this year. You know, it's already out there, so at least let's give a chance for legitimate users to get access to some of this. And also, it is very interesting with that specific U.S. call out. I'm sure that was something that, or I am not sure, I suspect that's something Iran insisted on in terms of just because, for obvious reasons, U.S. financial institutions would probably be a bit more than a bit risk averse, especially if it's only a 60-day license. And a lot of analysis can go into, does this license cover this transaction? So there is some additional comfort there with that specific U.S. call out.
Yeah, I
or
mean, I
US
think
dollar.
that kind of dates back to the JCPOA, where there were a lot of transactions that were either kind of, you know, secondary sanctions were lifted, and so European banks could do these transactions, but they weren't doing these transactions because they were still worried about OFAC sanctions, and so a lot of the provisions of the JCPOA, there was a hard time implementing them. So I think Iran was sensitive to that issue, and then, you know, I think the other issue that they're probably sensitive to was the fact that, you know, even in the humanitarian sanctions context where there've been, or the humanitarian exceptions context where there've been humanitarian exceptions for many years, it's still hard to get the banks involved. And so I suspect that was a call out that Iran insisted upon because of the reluctance of banks to process transactions that are authorized.
Um, but yeah, I think I wouldn't be shocked if this license or some variant of it was extended, assuming negotiations are not wrapped up in 60 days. I will be surprised if they're 100% wrapped up in 60 days.
Right.
Um,
There's a lot to do. Let's
there's
just
a
say
lot to
that.
do, a lot to do. And a lot of ways things can go sideways. I mean, I think we've already seen little bits of that in the news. And then, you know, the governments have to decide what is enough sideways for it to affect negotiations and what is a bump in the road that can be
Well, I mean, you know,
overcome. But
I watched Vice President Vance's press conference on this, and I thought, you know, my sense was that they took a very, for lack of a better term, kind of mature, grown-up view of this. Is we're engaged in a process. There's lots of actors out there who might want to disrupt the process. Obviously, we're not going to tolerate, you know, anything that is inconsistent with the ceasefire. On the other hand, we're also not going to give way to people who are just trying to disrupt the ceasefires because they don't like this agreement. And so we got to figure out what's noise and what's real and deal with it that way. And I thought that, like, that is an extremely mature way of looking at this, because the fact of the matter is that if you don't want to do a deal, then you can almost certainly find some act that is going to be inconsistent with the ceasefire to point to and say, deal's off, we're going back to war. But it didn't strike me that it struck me as, this is the attitude of somebody who really wants to get a deal done and understands that there will be challenges and that you have to kind of work through them. So we'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
we shall see. So on that, assuming that paragraph 7, it does not just ride off into the sunset on its own because things are impossible. What are going to be the hardest delistings under the Iran program?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's.
Well,
I mean,
and that's actually that kind of gives it away in some ways, because many of the hard ones are not listed just under the Iran program, as we mentioned earlier. Like, they're under Russia, they're under all of these others. So in some ways, that makes it easy to keep sanctions on them. But
then you're not giving sanctions relief, and people will get upset. Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things. One, I thought, you know, some of the vessels might be hard, but the vessels are in the GL. I will say that one of the I shouldn't say crazy, but one of the things that puzzles me about the GL is, let's say I have a sanctioned vessel that is sanctioned under one of these many programs, and I want to use that vessel to do a transaction in, let's say, Iraqi crude. Can I do that? No. It's the vessel is still sanctions. But if I want to move Iranian oil, I can use that same vessel to remove the Iranian oil. It does seem to create some weird incentives. I mean, if I wanted to use that vessel to move U.S. oil, I couldn't use that vessel to move U.S. oil, only Iranian oil, which is a little bit, strikes me as a little bit bizarre. I mean, I get why they're doing it, but
Yeah.
it is kind
Bizarre, but could be fun if you're an OFAC sanctions targeter, and it's like, aha, we knew you were engaged in the Iranian oil trade. Thank you for proving
exactly,
it.
exactly. But in terms of delistings, I mean, I think that that a lot of the recent listings have been in the petroleum industry, so those would have been struck me as kind of the most challenging. But they're all temporarily allowed to do almost anything in that industry as long as it involves Iranian oil. I think that the biggest challenge probably is going to be the FTO designation of the Revolutionary Guard. I assume that is going to be a front and center in the negotiations as to what sanctions relief means. I think as a practical matter that it is going to be very hard for Iran to accept a deal that has complete sanctions relief if the Revolutionary Guard is still a foreign terrorist organization, because that has so many different implications for who can deal with what is essentially the Iranian military and a part of the government and who cannot. On the other hand, I think from the U.S. side, it is going to be very difficult to accept a deal that requires some sort of admission that the IRGC is kind of no longer a terrorist organization and is kind of part of the respected community of foreign military or international military organizations. So that, I think, to me, like that's going to be the biggest challenge, is how do you work out issues like the IRGC. And then I think the other delistings are going to, the difficult delistings or the difficult challenges are going to relate to what happens when the U.S. raises the issue that a lot of these sanctions can't be lifted unless there are certain findings with respect to missiles, certain findings with respect to human rights, certain findings with respect to participation in international terrorism. Like, how does that factor in if the U.S., which in some ways the laws require it to do that, but in some ways I think that has been a historic sticking point in Iran negotiations, is when the U.S. tries to interject other issues of concern into those negotiations, the bargaining gets a lot harder. And so I think those, to me, like those are probably, at least based on history, likely to be some of the challenges over the next 60 days in terms of the negotiations and in terms of like who gets delisted and who doesn't.
Yep. Definitely agree on that. Yeah, it's interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Houthis were at one point delisted as an FTO and then promptly relisted, and I'm sure that is not what Iran would have in mind of if we want them off and off permanently.
Yeah, I mean, so but that again reflected a change of administration. I think the Trump 1 administration listed them. Biden's administration eventually delisted the Houthis, and then I think Trump 2 came back in and relisted the Houthis.
I forget the exact timeline, but that sounds close to right.
But I think that again, it certainly could be wrong. I'm just going from memory, but it does raise the issue that I think is going to be of concern to Iran, but less concern here than it would have been if this were a treaty or an agreement that they were negotiating with the Biden administration, right? Because, based on the JCPOA, how does Iran negotiate a deal and feel like it's going to stick for a reasonable amount of time? Like, the U.S. negotiated the JCPOA. By all accounts, Iran was complying with their obligations under the JCPOA. The U.S. withdrew anyway. How does it prevent that? I mean, obviously, that if you're in those shoes, you feel like you got burned. And how do you keep from getting burned? Again, because they're dealing with Trump now, and it's a deal with Trump, I think they'll be less concerned that a later president will then pull out of a deal that President Trump negotiated. But I do think that is potentially going to be another sticking point, is like, how do you lock the language in multiple ways so that you don't have a JCPOA 2?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one difference we may have here, just very broadly speaking, is more regional involvement in negotiations, which I think is very strategic and necessary from all sides. Um, who are your neighbors, Iran? who who is kind of not kind of who is within range and most affected by your proxies if your way of doing this is some kind of, oh, that's Hezbollah, not us, that's the Houthis, not us, that's I think there are a lot of vested interests, and I think recent events made very clear to people who maybe didn't have a reason to pay attention just how interconnected that whole area is, not just geographically, but with the oil, the energy industry, and kind of daily life in a lot of ways. Where before that, it's not that we generally speaking didn't know, but we didn't stop to think about some of that strategic geography and critical geography and some things like that.
I think that is going to be a big factor in terms of it. Regional buy-in for this deal is going to be very important. Is another issue that they're going to have to deal with at the negotiating table, and I assume that there is, certainly the actors in the direct region want this conflict to be over, and they want this conflict to be over for a long, long time. We'll see how that factors into the effectiveness and kind of the long-term viability of any deal. All right. Well, I think we have dealt with the emergency at this point. I think maybe we should make plans to meet again in 60 days to talk about what's happened with paragraph 7 and whether or not we've gotten to some sort of final resolution on a lot of the issues that we've just raised that the negotiating committee is going to have to work through. With that, any parting words, Melissa?
Oof, I don't think so, but I think other than there are probably a lot of reports to Congress ahead, and a lot of people probably stressing quite considerably over how on earth can we thread this needle and get there.
Well, we will wait and see. And with that, everyone, stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.